Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
Egypt prided herself on dominating this whole region. They wanted all of these surrounding nations to never worry about anything. Pharaoh God in Cairo will take care of you kind of thing. And yet they all fall together and Egypt's pride is marred. They see not just their mother nation, Egypt, but they see what they look to as their very God fall. And what a shock that would be, when you see the thing that is in your life that you're trusting the most fall.
How often do we consider the idea that our pride can falsely elevate us to the God of our own lives? Yet, are we sovereign? Today in Ezekiel, chapters 29 through 32, God confronts Egypt's pride and defiance. Pharaoh believed he was God. He thought his power, wealth, and influence made him untouchable. But God reminds the nations that no kingdom can stand against him. Through images of broken strength and coming judgment, Ezekiel shows that Egypt's real problem was spiritual rebellion rooted in pride. The message is simple and sobering. When pride defines a nation or a person, downfall follows. But God alone remains sovereign over all. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Ezekiel as he continues his message, Defining Egypt's Defiance.
And that's the idea, except what is he really talking about here? We know that the downfall of this particular Pharaoh in these days of Ezekiel is when Babylon comes to attack them. Babylon draws them out of Egypt and decimates them out of their own land. And so this prophecy very, very literally fulfilled. The interesting thing here is that Egypt was meticulous about their burial. I mean, even today we find Egyptian sarcophaguses and mummies, very meticulously wrapped and prepared for the dead because they believed in certain different principles of the afterlife. And here, what an insult that God's going to tell them, no, you're going to be pulled out by Babylon and just die in the field. That's the way this is going to go down. That is your punishment. God's even disrespecting their false beliefs of the afterlife, even in the way they're going to die. It's just showing his dominance, his superiority over all of their false beliefs. So that's kind of the idea here. Verse 6, then all of the inhabitants of Egypt will know that I am Yahweh. And emphasize the word I when you read that sometimes. The idea is to say, the God's not the crocodile, the God's not the sun, the God's not the Pharaoh, and all these other things. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. I am God when I show my dominance over all of these things. Just continuing verse 6. Because they have been only a staff made of reed to the house of Israel. In verse 7, when they seized you with the hand, you tore and split open all their shoulders. And when they leaned on you, you broke and made all their loins quake. The idea is Israel tried to have Egypt help them. But when Egypt tried to metaphorically lean on Egypt, like a reed, like a rod, it pierced through their hand. It wasn't any good. Egypt was like a staff easily broken. Egypt was not a reliable friend, not a reliable helper, is the idea of what he's saying. So Judah tried to lean on them for help, but God says, you're going to be like a little broken up bamboo stick that just breaks. It's not going to be helpful. And so God will remove that thought from Israel. This thought that, well, maybe we should just turn to Egypt. And Israel sooner or later will realize that's not going to help. And that's God's intention here, to get them to rely on him. And then verse 8 here. Verse 8, therefore, thus saith Lord Yahweh, behold, I will bring upon you a sword, and I will cut off from you man and beast. The land of Egypt will become like a desolation and a waste. Then they will know that I am Yahweh, because you said the Nile is mine, and I have made it. Therefore, in verse 10, behold, I am against you and against your canals of the Nile, and I will make the land of Egypt an utter waste and a desolation. In some translations, it says from Migdol to Syene. Maybe you have from the Tower of Syene. Migdol, that's what the town of Migdol means. The word means tower. Okay, so he's basically describing all over the land is the idea. And even over to the border of Ethiopia. And then verse 11, a man's foot will not pass through it, and the foot of a beast will not pass through it, and it will not be inhabited for 40 years. Verse 12, so I will make the land of Egypt a desolation in the midst of the desolated lands, and her cities in the midst of cities that are laid waste will be desolate for 40 years. And I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them among the land. So Egypt thought they were the source and the sustainer and just the object of all of their prosperity. And the Lord says, no, that's exactly why this punishment is coming. Because you thought you were all that, a bag of chips. You gave me no glory, no credit for any of this. And so God will remove that thought by their destruction. That is the idea. The entire land will be desolate and wiped out. Be sure, Egypt was the type of nation that it wasn't just them. Egypt's strength was in the fact that they had Libya and Ethiopia and all of these surrounding nations as a confederacy over all of these years. And so when it reads like, I will decimate you the whole way down to Ethiopia, that's why. That's why that whole area was confederate under the banner of Egypt themselves. And so just verse 13, we continue. For thus saith Lord Yahweh, at the end of the 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from the peoples among whom they were scattered. I will return the fortunes of Egypt and make them return to the land of Paphros, which again is one of the cities of Egypt, and to the land of their origin, and there they will be a lowly kingdom. For in verse 15, it will be the lowest of the kingdoms. It will never again lift itself up above the nations. Then I will make them so small that they will not have dominion over the nations, and it will never again be the security for the house of Israel, bringing to remembrance the iniquity of their having turned to go after Egypt. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. So though Egypt will be restored, and certainly they were in the days of the Greeks specifically, Egypt was brought back to a certain measure of prosperity, but they were never again, after this time, brought to that place of being a leader of anything. I mean, even in the modern days, Egypt is a nation that's generally at peace with Israel, and with many of the Arab nations. They're just a nation of not much significance. For as much natural power as they should be able to have, what gives a nation the ability to have some natural influence in the world? Natural resources. Waters, minerals, things like that. They have so much oil and all types of carbon, natural gas in the Mediterranean, and then the water of the Nile and the minerals that flow down the Nile. They have so much natural resource. They should be one of the dominating powers in this world today. Why aren't they? Because God put them in their place. And they've never again risen to anything of significance. And that is exactly what this shows. But it's by God's grace that he promises this heathen nation, though, that they will at least be restored and that they won't have a full end. There are other nations we've read about recently, including Edom and others, that God said, I'm going to be through with you. We're done here. And that is not the case with Egypt. In fact, you may remember, we're going to see them coming up in the book of Zechariah, being prophesied as being there during the 1,000-year millennial kingdom and their interaction with Israel in the kingdom to come. So there's more to come with Egypt in our future prophecy. We'll get to all that as we continue studying. So let's go to verse 17. Now, notice the shift here in verse 17. It actually goes to this is an entirely new prophecy. It's a whole new date. It's another prophecy altogether. If you went back to verse 1, you'd notice that all that we just read was given to Ezekiel in the 10th year, 10th month, okay, which was immediately before Jerusalem was conquered. Well, now, beginning in verse 17, notice the timing is the 27th year in the first month on the first of the month, the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made his military force labor hard against Tyre, the nation of Tyre, north of Israel. Every head was made bald and every shoulder was rubbed bare, but he and his military force had no wages from Tyre for the labor that they had labored against it. Let me just pause it. We've had a little bit of a break here from when we talked about Tyre. You might Tyre in modern day Lebanon, right? You remember we talked about how when Babylon went to attack them, Tyre simply retreated to their island nation. And so although Babylon sieged that city for 13 years, they took no spoil. because the people of Tyre and Sidon took all of their wares out to their island city. They were the world's greatest navy and commerce. And so Babylon, for all their effort to try to destroy Tyre, didn't get anything out of it. And so the Lord's using that right here to say, because Babylon didn't get anything out of that attack on Tyre, now he continues in verse 19, and he says, therefore, thus saith Lord Yahweh, behold, I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off her abundance and capture her spoil and seize her plunder, and it will be wages for his military force. I have given him the land of Egypt for his work, which he labored, because they acted for me, declares Lord Yahweh. And be sure to note, this is the very latest dated prophecy of everything that Ezekiel wrote down, this 27th year. This is 16 years after Jerusalem's fall, that this is being written by Ezekiel. And so Babylon dominated Egypt for all of these years as payment, God says, for being God's tool of judgment, to judge not only Judah and Israel, but to judge all of these surrounding nations. God used them. God knows how to use sin sinlessly. And that will be one of those things that when we get to heaven, the Lord will explain that to us better. But remember that often punishment isn't because punishment is never because God has to jump in and send down, lightning bolts from heaven. That's not the way it works. That's called God's wrath. Okay. That's something different than just punishment. Punishment for our sins on this earth, like we see in Egypt, is always meted out by somebody else. What does God have to do to allow this? Just step back, stop restraining evil. That's often the way the New Testament refers to it, is the Holy Spirit within the church is called the restraining force in Thessalonians, right? And all God has to do to allow evil to be punished by another evildoer is just to step back, take one layer back, go back 2 steps, and all of a sudden more evil unleashes. And the Lord allowed Babylon to do this, to enact this punishment on Egypt for their treatment of Israel. And so that's what we're seeing here. And Babylon will be rewarded for that. It's interesting. If you remember, when we were reading through Jeremiah recently about some of these Babylonians' attacks, we were reading about how God was judging these foreign nations using Babylon. And then in the book of Jeremiah, then we got to a chapter where it says God's judging Babylon. And we're like, I thought you told him to do this, right? And we read in Jeremiah where it said that Babylon went beyond their mandate. They didn't simply punish the foreign nations as they should have, but they went and took retribution. They went farther than they should have. They killed innocents. They did other atrocities that God never asked them to do. And so they were judged themselves for going beyond in those matters. But in the simplest of senses, God backed off and let Babylon have their way as a punishment on these nations. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. And then we finish in verse 21. On that day, I will make a horn sprout for the house of Israel, and I will open your mouth. He's talking to Ezekiel. I will open your mouth in their midst. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. And so as these nations are judged, Israel will begin to see a way back for their nation. Remember, they're sitting in Babylonian captivity as some of these other nations are finally meeting their punishment and getting crushed down. And Israel's looking at all of this that's happening and realizing like, wow, maybe we will have a possibility of going back to our land after everything settles out and shakes out. So Ezekiel himself here will have his mouth opened to speak to the people and to encourage them. And belief begins to grow in the midst of Israel and these Jews that are still there in Babylon. And so there it is. There's the problem of Egypt detailed, their pride of believing that they are the source of everything and they're the reason they're supposed to be prospering. We go to chapter 30 now. Chapter 30 continues this discussion of Egypt, but it takes it from a really different angle. It begins to describe God's method of judging them. And it's kind of what we just started talking about at the very end of chapter 29, is that the method of God dealing with Egypt's defiance is just that. God will restrain evil until he doesn't. until all of a sudden he just says, I'm not going to restrain evil anymore, and you will be judged. That really is the subject of chapter 30. We see how this judgment begins to now fall on Egypt. And so we begin verse 1 of chapter 30. The word of Yahweh came again to me and said, Son of man, prophesy and say, Thus saith Lord Yahweh, Wail, alas for the day is near, even the day of Yahweh is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. In verse 4, a sword will come upon Egypt, and anguish will be in Ethiopia when the slain fall in Egypt. They take away her multitude, and her foundations are pulled down. So we begin to see here not only a warning to Egypt, but also a warning to the surrounding nations that supported Egypt, Ethiopia and Libya and others. Put is one of the ancient names of Libya. And so as Egypt is judged, these surrounding nations that supported Egypt are crushed right along with them. And we'll now begin to get some big long lists here. So just please let me point out to you, this chapter is more of a lamentation. It's more of a wailing song. So there's some long poetic language. So don't think that every last word of that needs to be explained. It's just long poetic language that makes in sometimes just a very simplistic point. So that's why we can read sort of big sections of this that just makes a singular point. And so we continue it in verse 5. He begins to mention all of these surrounding nations that were helping Egypt, like Ethiopia and Put and Lud. Put and Lud were both in modern Libya. And then it says all Arabia. You may have a translation there of all of the mingled people. That's literally what Arabia means. If you think of the modern nation of Saudi Arabia, that's what it means. The mingled people of the house of Saud is what that means for the modern country. And so Libya is mentioned here, and the people of the land that is in covenant will fall with them by the sword. In verse 6, Thus saith Yahweh, Indeed those who support Egypt will fall, and the pride of her strength will come down from these different cities, from Migdol to Cyrene. Again, you may have from the Tower of Cyrene. It's all over the land is the idea. They will fall within her by the sword, declares Lord Yahweh. In verse 7, they will be desolate in the midst of the desolated lands, and her cities will be in the midst of the cities laid waste. And they will know that I am Yahweh when I set a fire in Egypt, and all her helpers are broken. On that day, in verse 9, messengers will go forth from me in ships to frighten secure Ethiopia, and anguish will be on them as on the day of Egypt, for behold, it is coming. Egypt prided herself on dominating this whole region. They wanted all of these surrounding nations to never worry about anything. Pharaoh God in Cairo will take care of you kind of thing. And yet they all fall together, and Egypt's pride is marred. They see not just their mother nation, Egypt, but they see what they look to as their very God fall. And what a shock that would be, when you see the thing that is in your life that you're trusting the most fall. Have you ever done that with something stupid like a car or something else? Like you build up this possession as it's bigger than it should be in your life, right? And then all of a sudden you wreck it, and you're like, oh, why am I experiencing such anguish over this? Because you built it up to be more than it should be, right? You made it more important than it should be in your life. Some have done that with relationships. Then it's gone. Right? And you build it to be more than it is. That's what these nations are dealing with. They're dealing with this shock of losing this thing that they thought would never fall. And now it's gone. And then in verse 10, Thus saith Lord Yahweh, I will also make the multitude of Egypt to cease by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He and his people with him, the most ruthless of the nations. I think that was Boaz's name before he was married, wasn't it? Before Boaz got married? Wasn't that his name, Ruthless? Okay, never mind. It's just lots of words here. I thought I would break it up for a second. Good job for those of you that caught that. So the most ruthless of the nations will be brought in to make the land a ruin, and they will draw their swords against Egypt and fill the land with the slain, In verse 12, moreover, I will make the canals of the Nile dry and sell the land into the hands of evil men. And I will make the land desolate as well as its fullness by the hand of strangers. I, Yahweh, have spoken. So God is going to use the ruthless Nebuchadnezzar to do his work. And again, I say to you, God knows how to use a sinner sinlessly, without himself getting involved in the sin. He just steps back. He withdraws his protection. He withdraws his provision and his help. It just lets sinners have their way. And these things tend to happen. So, yeah. And even today, when the Holy Spirit leaves at the rapture of the church, you think our country is wicked now? You think your workplace is wicked now? Wait till the church is raptured out of here. This place is going to fall apart in a hurry. And this will continue to get worse and worse. In fact, I want to just read this from Matthew chapter 24. This is the way the Lord himself said it on the Mount of Olives, given his end times discourse. He said, unless those end days, unless they were cut short, no life would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, and in this case, he's talking about Israel, for Israel's sake, those days will be cut short. So that is how wicked it will get as we get towards the end. Lawlessness will abound. You read in Timothy chapter 3 about the end days and how men's hearts are horribly wicked in the ends. It's not going to get better. We know that. Yeah, let's continue verse 13. Thus saith Lord Yahweh, I will also destroy the idols and make the images cease from Memphis. That's a town in Egypt again. And there will no longer be a prince in the land of Egypt. And I will put fear in the land of Egypt. I will make Pathros desolate. I will set a fire in Zoan and execute judgments in Thebes. All of these are cities. And I will pour my wrath on Sin. Again, another city. It's not like evil. It's an actual city. They are the strong defense of Egypt. I will also cut off the multitudes of Thebes. Verse 16, I will set a fire in Egypt. Sin will writhe in anguish. Thebes will be breached, and Memphis will have distresses daily. In verse 17, the choice men of those cities there will fall by the sword, and the women will go into captivity. In Tahaphanes, the day will be dark when I break there the bars of the yoke of Egypt. Then the pride of her strength will cease in her. A cloud will cover her, and her daughters will go into captivity. Thus I will execute judgments on Egypt, and they will know that I am Yahweh. Do you see that emphasis he continues to make? They will stop trusting in themselves, and they will be forced to think there is something bigger than us. We're missing something. See, this is one of the greatest things the hard times is supposed to do. It's supposed to drive us to say, who's doing this? What is this all about? What is this force that's controlling all this? It's bigger than I ever imagined. And so all of Egypt's idolatry, God's wrath will fall on it throughout the whole country and deal with their idolatry. And it forces them, as their idols are falling one by one, to say, who is this God that's higher than ours? That's what it should do. That's what it's designed to do. And then verse 20, and now we have a new date here in verse 20. In the 11th year, in the first month, on the 7th day of the month, the word of Yahweh came to me saying, and he's about to give this next prophecy. Let me point something out to you. If you're somebody in the room is thinking to themselves, why do they keep bouncing back and forth, right? If you wrote a letter to your best friend, you're going to write it in order, right? This date, and then the following date, and then the following date. And somebody's thinking, well, why is he bouncing all around? Why did he get a letter that he wrote, the last and put it earlier on? Why aren't they in order? Well, you have to remember that Hebrew writers, and really all Eastern writers, whether they were Hebrew or Shemitic of any kind, or Arabic for that matter, they always write in what they believe is the matter of importance. So they will write and record things in the matter of importance to them. And then they continue down to more details. You ever wondered why Genesis chapter 2 exists? We pretty much already got it in chapter 1. Why is chapter 2 there? Because it gives further details of what chapter 1 gave. It's the same thing here. That's the reason why these letters that he wrote at these different times are in this order. So if you've ever wondered that, that's why. They simply have a different method of how they choose to record things. They try to write things that they believe is the most important and then fill in more details as they go.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Ezekiel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check us out at our website at ccchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Ezekiel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.